Number one in the post-spring SEC power rankings, none other than the Texas Longhorns. And every SEC fan groans. But they know it's true, right? The Texas Longhorns have had a great offseason. They had a great past couple seasons making the semifinals of the playoffs. Obviously, the big storyline is Arch Manning taking over, finally getting his shot at, going into the season as starting quarterback. He started a couple games in the past couple years with Quinn Ewers being hurt, but he's got some help. He's got Trey Wisner at running back. He's got Ryan Wingo at the wide receiver skill positions. I can expect to probably see Khalik Lockett, Jamie French, some of these freshmen that Sark was able to get to come to Austin. They're dynamic players. I think he'll get them on the field as much as he can. Defensive side of the ball, again, they're going to have to replace a lot of defensive linemen, but they did that last year and they did it just fine. But Cole Brevard transferred in from Purdue, one of the lone bright spots for the Boilers last season. He's coming over, but shoot, Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill Jr., Trey Moore, they are all back for an absolutely loaded front seven. And then you got Michael Taft, walk-on, turned into All-American, anchoring that secondary for the Longhorns.
Yeah, I mean, really, when you start with Texas, man, it's just that nobody has, I think it was Josh Pate that said this, and he's right, that nobody has been better at the talent acquisition in college football through high school recruiting and the transfer portal than Sark in Texas over the last 2 or 3 years, especially the last 2 years. They're doing an incredible job of recruiting from the high school level. Like you mentioned, some of those 5-star wide receivers. They brought in 2 5-star wide receivers that they brought in, multiple defensive guys that are, including the number 1 overall player in the country in Justice Terry. They brought in from the defensive line in high school recruiting. But they're doing a fantastic job of supplementing that through the transfer portal. They're not building their entire roster through the transfer portal. They're fitting their needs in the transfer portal. And like you mentioned, a couple of years in a row, they've done that on the defensive line, and they needed to. But what's interesting about Texas is when you think about Sark and his offenses, usually in the past, it's more like you think that they're another one that because they score a lot of points, they're high flying and just sling the ball all over the yard. Sark's offense is humming the best when they can run the rock. And last year, going into the season, C.J. Baxter, a former 5-star, one of the top running backs in the country, got hurt right out of the gate. That was a huge loss for the Longhorns. A lot of people talked about that being an issue for them going into the season. And, of course, all they do is step up with Jaden Blue. And you mentioned Q Wisner. Wisner rushed for over 1,000 yards last year. So now having C.J. Baxter back healthy to combine him with Q Wisner in the running game. And also we've seen enough of Arch Manning to see that he's also a threat, a major threat in the run game, especially in the QB power run game. So having that 3-headed monster in the backfield with the ability to be able to run the football and Sark to be able to dial up some plays coming off the play action, which is when his offense, again, is working the best. I think this Texas offense is going to be just fine. They're replacing some very solid pass catchers, their top 2 pass catchers, in Matthew Golden, who went first round to the Packers, and Gunnar Helm at tight end. But like Sark does, like I said, they brought in multiple 5-star freshman wide receivers, brought in a couple of transfers. But I do like what they're going to have in Ryan Wingo, who was one of the top receivers in the country coming out of high school last year. And a guy that really came on down the stretch for them last year was DeAndre Moore at receiver. So having him and Ryan Wingo together at receiver, I think the offense is going to be fine. But something that I did not have on my bingo card when Texas hired Sark would be that probably the biggest talking point with Texas is their defense. That is why this Texas team has staying power. They're not the Texas team that was at the beginning of Sark's career and before Sark, where they just came out every year, were highly ranked, and then they underachieved. That's not this Texas team anymore. Back-to-back semifinals appearances. They're the only team in the country that has back-to-back semifinals appearances. And a lot of that is due to the play on both sides of the ball at the line of scrimmage, and especially this defense. Texas last year was top 3 in the country, 3rd in the country in total defense and scoring defense. And they still return a lot of production from that defense. Tyler, would you think that off the top of your head in college football that there's a better combination of inside linebacker and edge rusher than Texas has with Anthony Hill Jr. and Colin Simmons?
No, it's hard. It's hard to come up with someone that beats that.
Exactly. And then you've got on top of that on the other edge, Trey Moore coming back. So defensively, I mean, Pete Kwiatkowski, the defensive coordinator that they brought over, that Sark brought in from Washington when he got there, has, I'm going to say quietly, when people talk about top defensive coordinators in all of college football, he doesn't really get mentioned. And he's now built a track record that warrants him being considered as one of the top defensive coordinators in college football, with the defense that Texas put out 2 years ago, and then having a top 3 defense and total defense and scoring defense last year. I think that he needs to be mentioned as one of the top defensive coordinators overall in college football. So with the added depth in the portal, with what they're bringing back, the overall talent acquisition, and obviously we didn't sit here and, as the kids say, glaze over Arch Manning forever, like I'm sure that most people thought we would, because why not? Everybody's excited about the Arch Manning era at Texas. But it's the overall team in general at Texas that makes them, while we have them power ranked as the number 1 overall team in the SEC right now post spring ball. And obviously, if Arch Manning lives up to the hype or even close to the hype, this Texas team will be able to compete at another shot in a national semifinal and a national championship level team. That's how good this Texas team can be.
Yeah, and again, we're basing this all off of returning production, talent acquisition, coaching, really trying hard not to look at schedules, but it's really hard to ignore that August 30th matchup in the Horseshoe against the defending national champions in Ohio State.
It's as good as the season openers we've had in college football, like on paper, like in a long, long time.
I mean, the whole day, the whole weekend is going to be stacked, but that game specifically, yeah. I mean, but what a better chance, Ohio State obviously has a lot of turnover that's happening right now. So what better chance for Texas, because they didn't do it last year, right? I mean, lost to Georgia twice. Everybody knows that their schedule last year was one of the weakest in the SEC. It's going to be that same way this year, even though they got to go to Georgia this year. But
second weakest conference schedule in the SEC last year. Only Mizzou had a weaker schedule.
Yeah, and so, I mean, a couple of years ago when they were in the Big 12, they went to Bama, they beat Bama, but can they do it again? Can they beat Ohio State in the Horseshoe?
Yeah, I mean, Texas, the last 2 years, made a statement early on in the season to let everybody know that they were one of the best teams in the country, by the way, that they went into Tuscaloosa 2 years ago, like you just said, and really just punked Bama in that fourth quarter. Bama had the lead going into the fourth quarter, and Texas took over in the fourth quarter, and then Texas just absolutely shellacked Michigan last year in the Big House. Michigan obviously ended up being down, but still, that defense for Michigan was legit, and Texas made them look like just awful in that game. So can they do something similar to that? Can they go on the road for the third year in a row in a marquee non-conference game and win in the Horseshoe at Ohio State? And I want to say this before we move on. You and I love it that these top-tier teams do challenge themselves out of conference. When Texas scheduled these games, it's hard to beat, man, that they're scheduling these games in advance and scheduling like blue blood programs like a Michigan and a home and home. And they're scheduling Ohio State in a home and home. And they're scheduling Alabama in a home and home. Being willing to go on the road and challenge themselves against those types of teams, that's awesome that Texas is doing that. Because it's not their fault. It's Greg Sankey's fault and the league office's fault of the SEC that they gift wrap Texas such an SEC like weaker schedule in the conference in the SEC. That's not Texas's fault. But two things can be true before Texas fans are listening to this and getting mad. They can be one of the best teams in the country and be a legit national championship contender, and they also can have a weaker in-conference SEC schedule. Both of those things are true.